In the autumn of 1950, the physicist Wolfgang Pauli arrived at Jung's home in Küsnacht for what had become a regular occurrence over the past 2 decades, a conversation that neither quantum mechanics nor analytical psychology could contain on its own. Pauli was not an ordinary visitor. He held the Nobel Prize in physics. He had formulated the exclusion principle that governed the behavior of every electron in the universe. He was regarded by his colleagues as one of the most brilliant and most merciless minds in theoretical physics, a man whose criticism was so feared that younger physicists called it the Pauli effect, though the term had originally meant something else entirely. The original Pauli effect was stranger than any intellectual intimidation. Throughout his career, laboratory equipment had a documented tendency to malfunction, break down, or explode in Pauli's presence. Instruments that had functioned perfectly for years would fail the moment he entered the room. In one famous incident, a complicated apparatus at the University of Göttingen collapsed without explanation at the precise moment Pauli's train passed through the station. The phenomenon was so consistent and so well documented that physicists had stopped treating it as a joke. Something about Pauli's psyche seemed to reach into the physical world and rearrange it, and no one, least of all Pauli himself, could explain how. It was this unexplained connection between the inner world of the psyche and the outer world of physical events that had brought Pauli to Jung in the first place. Jung had been analyzing Pauli's dreams, over 1,000 of them, and finding in them a symbolic structure that mirrored the deepest patterns of physics, quaternities, symmetries, and images of a unified reality that lay beneath the apparent division between mind and matter. On this particular afternoon, Jung had something to show Pauli that would take their conversation into new territory. He brought to the table not a patient's dream journal or a physics paper, but a deck of tarot cards. He laid them face down in a spread and asked Pauli to select several without looking at them. Pauli regarded the cards with the skepticism that had made him famous. He had dismantled the theoretical frameworks of physicists far more eminent than himself. He was not about to be impressed by fortune-telling. But Jung was not offering fortune-telling. He was proposing an experiment. "I am not interested in what the cards predict," Jung said. "I am interested in which cards you select and why those cards, at this moment, in this configuration, should correspond to anything meaningful at all." Pauli understood immediately. This was not a question about superstition. It was a question about the nature of reality itself. In physics, events were connected by causes. One billiard ball struck another, and the second moved in a direction determined by the laws of mechanics. Every effect had a cause, and every cause produced its effect through a chain of physical interactions that could, in principle, be traced and measured. But Pauli's own experience, and the strange phenomenon that bore his name, suggested that this picture was incomplete. There seemed to be connections between events that were not causal, that could not be explained by any chain of physical interactions, yet were too consistent and too meaningful to be dismissed as random chance. A patient dreamed of a golden scarab, and a real beetle appeared at the window. Laboratory equipment failed when a particular physicist walked into the room. A card was drawn from a shuffled deck, and its image corresponded precisely to the psychological situation of the person who drew it. These connections were what Jung had been studying for decades under a name that had taken him years to formulate: synchronicity. Jung explained to Pauli, though by this point in their collaboration, the explanation was more of a shared refinement than a lecture, that synchronicity was not a mystical concept. It was, he proposed, a principle of nature as fundamental as causality itself, but operating on an entirely different basis. Where causality connected events through chains of physical interaction, synchronicity connected events through meaning. Two events occurred simultaneously or in close proximity, not because one caused the other, but because both were expressions of the same underlying pattern, the way two clocks on the same wall could show the same time, not because one controlled the other, but because both were governed by the same mechanism. The mechanism, Jung argued, was the archetype. The archetypes of the collective unconscious were not merely psychological patterns. They were psychoed, a term Jung used to indicate that they operated at a level deeper than the division between psyche and matter, a level where the inner world of the mind and the outer world of physical events had not yet separated into distinct domains. When an archetype was activated, by a crisis, a developmental threshold, a moment of intense psychological significance, it created a field of meaning that could manifest simultaneously in both the inner world as a dream, an emotion, an intuition, and the outer world as a coincidence, an accident, an unexpected encounter, or the particular card that fell from a shuffled deck at a particular moment. This was the point at which Jung turned the tarot cards face up. Pauli had selected 5 cards. Jung did not interpret them as a fortune teller would, reading the future from their arrangement. Instead, he examined them as a physicist would examine experimental data, looking for patterns, correlations, and meaningful structure. What he found confirmed what years of private experimentation with the cards had taught him. The cards Pauli had selected corresponded, with a precision that could not be attributed to chance, to the central psychological themes that their analysis had been circling for months. The Wheel of Fortune had appeared, the card Jung associated most directly with the principle of synchronicity itself. Jung picked up the wheel and held it where they could both study it. The card depicted a great wheel suspended in the sky, turned by no visible hand, with figures rising on one side and falling on the other. At the 4 corners sat the fixed signs of the zodiac: the angel, the eagle, the lion, and the bull, each absorbed in a book of knowledge, recording but not controlling the wheel's revolution. At the top of the wheel sat a sphinx, holding a sword, representing the riddle that the turning posed to every mind that encountered it. Was the pattern random, or was it meaningful? Was the wheel turned by chance, or by something that transcended chance without violating it? This, Jung told Pauli, was the card of synchronicity, not because the wheel predicted the future, but because it depicted the fundamental question that synchronicity raised, the question of whether meaning existed in the fabric of reality itself, or was merely projected onto it by the human mind. Pauli, characteristically, pushed back. As a physicist, he could accept that events might be connected by something other than causality. Quantum mechanics had already demonstrated that particles could be correlated across distances in ways that violated classical notions of cause and effect. But correlation was not meaning. 2 entangled particles were connected, but their connection did not signify anything. It simply was. What Jung was proposing was something far more radical, that the connections between events could carry meaning, that the universe was organized not only by physical law, but by something closer to what a poet would call significance. Jung did not retreat from this position. He told Pauli that the entire history of human experience testified to the existence of meaningful coincidence, and that the insistence on reducing all connections between events to physical causality was not a discovery of science, but an assumption of the Western mind, an assumption so deeply embedded that it felt not like an assumption at all, but like the shape of reality itself. He described the event that had crystallized his thinking about synchronicity decades earlier. A patient had been in analysis with him for some time without making significant progress. She was a woman of exceptional intelligence and exceptional resistance, whose rational mind constructed elaborate defenses against every attempt to reach the deeper layers of her psyche. Jung had tried every approach in his repertoire, and all had failed. The analysis had reached an impasse that seemed unbreakable. Then, during one session, the woman began to describe a dream she had had the previous night. In the dream, someone had given her a golden scarab, an Egyptian symbol of rebirth. As she spoke these words, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He turned, opened the window, and caught the insect that was trying to enter the room. It was a scarabid beetle, the closest analog to a golden scarab that existed in the Swiss climate. He held it out to his patient and said, "Here is your scarab." The effect was immediate and profound. The woman's rational defenses, which had resisted every technique of analysis, shattered in a single instant. Not because Jung had been clever, not because he had found the right interpretation, but because reality itself had intervened in the therapeutic process in a way that her rationalism could not explain, absorb, or dismiss. The beetle had no causal connection to the dream. No chain of physical events could explain why, at the precise moment, a woman spoke of a golden scarab in a psychologist's consulting room in Zurich. An actual scarab-like beetle should appear at the window. Yet there it was. And its appearance carried meaning. The meaning of rebirth, of breaking through, of transformation, that was directly relevant to the woman's psychological situation. This, Jung told Pauli, was synchronicity in its purest form. An inner event and an outer event coinciding not through any causal mechanism, but through a shared meaning that connected them at a level deeper than the physical. Pauli was silent for a long time. Then he asked the question that Jung had been waiting for. "And the cards?" he said. "You believe they operate on the same principle?" Jung nodded. "The tarot," he explained, was the most sophisticated synchronistic instrument that Western civilization had produced. Unlike the I Ching, the ancient Chinese oracle that Jung had studied for decades and whose underlying principle he considered identical, the tarot operated through images rather than texts, through visual symbols that spoke directly to the unconscious mind without the mediation of rational interpretation. When a person shuffled a deck of tarot cards and laid them out in a spread, they were not consulting a supernatural oracle. They were creating conditions under which synchronicity could operate. The shuffling of the cards was a physical act governed, in principle, by the laws of mechanics, the weight of the cards, the force of the shuffle, the friction between surfaces. A physicist could, in theory, calculate which card would end up in which position if given sufficiently precise data about the initial conditions. In practice, the system was so complex and so sensitive to initial conditions that the outcome was effectively unpredictable, as random as any physical process could be. And yet the cards that appeared were not random, not always, not for everyone. But with a consistency that decades of observation had convinced Jung could not be attributed to chance alone, the cards that a person selected tended to correspond to their psychological situation with an accuracy that rational probability could not account for. The archetype was the connecting principle. When a person approached the cards in a state of genuine psychological need, not as a parlor game, but as an authentic inquiry into their own situation, the archetype that was active in their psyche at that moment created a field of meaning that influenced both the inner experience and the outer event. The archetype did not cause the cards to arrange themselves in a meaningful pattern. It created the conditions of meaning within which a particular arrangement became significant. This was a crucial distinction, and Jung made it with care. Synchronicity was not magic. It did not propose that the mind controlled matter or that wishing made things so. It proposed something more subtle and, in its way, more disturbing, that mind and matter were not as separate as Western science assumed, that at the deepest level they shared a common ground, what Jung called the unus mundus, the one world, and that under certain conditions, the patterns of this common ground became visible in the form of meaningful coincidences. Pauli recognized in this formulation something that resonated with his own work at the frontiers of physics. Quantum mechanics had already demolished the notion that the observer and the observed were independent of each other. The act of measurement influenced what was measured. The physicist who designed an experiment to detect particles found particles. The physicist who designed an experiment to detect waves found waves. Reality, at the quantum level, seemed to respond to the way it was questioned. Was it so different with the tarot? The person who approached the cards with a genuine question created conditions, psychological conditions, not physical ones, under which the cards could respond. Not because the cards were conscious, not because they contained any power of their own, but because the act of genuine inquiry activated the archetype, and the archetype, operating at the psychoid level beneath the division of mind and matter, organized both the question and the answer into a meaningful pattern. Jung smiled at this formulation. It was, he said, the best description of how the tarot worked that he had ever heard, and it had come from a physicist. But the principle, he cautioned, had limitations that were essential to understand. Synchronicity did not operate on demand. It could not be summoned by an act of will, any more than a dream could be summoned by deciding to dream a particular dream. The connecting factor was not the conscious intention of the person, but the activation of the archetype, and archetypes were activated by genuine psychological necessity, not by curiosity or entertainment. This was why the same deck of cards could produce profound insights for one person and meaningless noise for another. It was why readings done in a spirit of genuine inquiry tended to be startlingly accurate, while readings done as party games tended to produce nothing of value. The cards themselves were neutral. They were a mirror. But a mirror could only reflect what stood before it, and if nothing of psychological depth was present, the mirror reflected nothing of depth. He told Pauli about a demonstration he had given years earlier at a seminar. A student had challenged him, arguing that if the cards truly operated through synchronicity, they should produce meaningful results regardless of the questioner's state of mind. Jung had invited the student to shuffle the deck and draw 3 cards while thinking about what he wanted for dinner. The student drew 3 cards that bore no discernible relationship to anything at all. Jung then asked a woman in the seminar who had been sitting in visible distress throughout the evening. She had recently learned that her husband was leaving her to draw 3 cards while holding her situation in mind. She drew the Tower, she drew the Star, and she drew the Wheel of Fortune. The 3 cards, in sequence, described her situation with a precision that caused the room to fall silent. Catastrophe, the quiet light that follows catastrophe, and the turning that made both destruction and renewal part of a single pattern. The student who had challenged Jung asked how this was possible. Jung replied that it was not possible in any sense that the word was normally used. It could not be explained by any mechanism that connected cause to effect. It could only be understood as an instance of meaningful coincidence, and a causal connection between the woman's inner state and the outer configuration of the cards, mediated by the archetype that was active in her psyche at that moment. The Wheel of Fortune, Jung continued, was the card that held the key to understanding why synchronicity was not merely an interesting anomaly, but a fundamental principle. The wheel depicted a pattern that recurred at every level of existence, in the rise and fall of civilizations, in the cycles of nature, in the stages of an individual life, and in the archetypal sequence of the major arcana themselves. This recurrence was not caused by any single mechanism. It was a property of the pattern itself, the way a spiral appeared in galaxies, in seashells, in the growth of plants, and in the structure of DNA. Not because galaxies cause seashells, but because the spiral was a pattern inherent in the fabric of reality, expressing itself at every scale through whatever medium was available. The archetypes, Jung proposed, were patterns of this kind. They existed at a level of reality that preceded the division of mind and matter, and they expressed themselves through both domains simultaneously. When the wheel turned in a person's life, when a cycle completed, when what had been ascending began to descend, when what had been hidden began to emerge. The turning manifested both internally, as a shift in psychological state, and externally, as a change in circumstances, an unexpected encounter, or the appearance of a particular card at a particular moment in a particular spread. Pauli and Jung continued their conversation until well after dark. Before he left, Pauli made an observation that Jung would record in his notes and return to many times in the years that followed. Pauli said that the deepest lesson of both quantum physics and synchronicity was the same, that the universe was not a machine. A machine operated through causes and effects, and in principle, every state of a machine could be predicted from its previous state. The universe, at its most fundamental level, was not like this. It was more like a conversation, a continuous, evolving exchange between patterns and events, between structure and spontaneity, between the known and the unknowable, in which meaning was not imposed from outside, but arose from the interaction itself. The tarot, Pauli suggested, was a technology for participating in this conversation, not for predicting it, not for controlling it, but for listening to it. The cards were a language in which the universe's side of the conversation could become visible, if only for a moment, if only in glimpses, if only to those who had learned that the most important answers were the ones that could not be calculated. Jung walked Pauli to the door. As the physicist stepped into the autumn night, he paused and looked up at the sky. The stars were out, those ancient points of light that human beings had been reading for meaning since the beginning of consciousness. "We are very strange creatures," Pauli said. "We build instruments to measure the universe, and then we are surprised to discover that the universe has been measuring us." Jung watched him walk to his car, then returned to his study. On the table where they had sat, the tarot cards remained in the spread where Pauli had laid them. The Wheel of Fortune occupied the center of the spread, its figures rising and falling in their eternal revolution, turned by no visible hand, governed by no calculable law, yet turning with a regularity that suggested something deeper than chance and more intimate than mechanism. He did not clear the cards that night. He left them where they lay, as one might leave a letter that had arrived from a correspondent whose address was unknown and whose next message could neither be predicted nor prevented, only